The Man in the Backyard. The old house we used to live in seemed like any other on the block, but there was always something off about our neighbor next door. I can still remember the chill that crept up my spine when I realized what he was doing. He would watch me sleep, standing in our backyard, eyes locked on my bedroom window. My mom caught him once. I had woken up to her yanking my bedroom blind shut with a horrified expression on her face. When I asked what was going on, she said, "He was out there, just staring." From that day forward, I kept those blinds closed, not daring to let in even a sliver of moonlight. I never wanted to see his silhouette out there in the darkness again. It didn't stop there. The neighbor was strange, unpredictable, and dangerous. At one point, he set his own basement on fire, threw a Molotov cocktail through his window, all because he wanted a new dryer. Who does that? But the real nightmare started after we moved out, leaving the house in the care of my older brother. Even with us gone, the neighbor wasn't finished tormenting us. He started breaking into the house when my brother was at work. My brother would come home to find random items missing, his things rummaged through, and worst of all, his dog cowering in the bathroom, terrified. We could never prove it was him, but we knew. It wasn't until a different neighbor, one who was keeping an eye on the place, caught him in the act that things started to fall into place. He'd been breaking in and casually shoveling our yard in some twisted show of mock neighborliness. He was even spotted carrying a blowtorch, but still, nothing was done. No cops, no consequences. Eventually, he broke in again, and this time, he went all out. Using the blowtorch, he cut out copper pipes from the basement, flooding it in the process. Then he set the house on fire. Our old home, the place filled with memories, trinkets, and pieces of our lives, was ruined. Everything stored there was lost to flames and water damage. My brother was away at work, but thankfully, his dog was at his mom's place that day. I shudder to think of what could have happened if the dog had been home, trapped in that chaos. When we went back to see the aftermath, my dad found our shovel jammed into the door and our old computer monitor discarded in the trash. The evidence was everywhere, yet the detective never came. Despite everything, the neighbor's obvious involvement, the witnesses, he got away with it. No arrest, no justice. Creepy neighbor. This story still haunts me and my boyfriend to this day. It happened 2 years ago, and I'm still trying to cope with the trauma it left behind. Back then, I had just moved to the UK for university. I was desperate for a fresh start, wanting to get away from my family's toxic environment. My first year was great. I made some wonderful friends, and though I hadn't met my boyfriend yet, I enjoyed the freedom of living independently for the first time. When my second year came around, some friends and I decided to rent a student house together. We wanted more space and fewer restrictions than the cramped, shared flats we had endured in our first year. The house had a small backyard with a thin wooden door that opened out to the back street, where we kept our bins and old junk. The door was so old that we had to tie it shut with strings because it didn't have a proper lock. I ended up in a ground floor room, with my window facing the backyard. It was convenient for me since I smoked and could step out there anytime I wanted. We had neighbors on both sides, mostly families and some other student houses, but the ones to our right were different. It was a group of 5 guys who looked way older than the usual university students. And to put it bluntly, they were weird. The first time I really met one of them was during a chaotic incident involving the police. One of the guys had attacked his flatmates with a kitchen knife and set their kitchen on fire. We heard the screams, so my flatmates and I rushed outside. There, we saw one of them, bleeding and covered in cuts, with a deep gash on his head. We didn't know what else to do, so we helped him clean up and gave him an old t-shirt to change into. The police eventually dragged the attacker off in handcuffs, but we were left rattled and uneasy. The guy we helped was strange. He talked a lot of nonsense and kept trying to grab my arm and flirt with me while we bandaged him up. He reeked of marijuana and though we felt uneasy around him, we brushed it off as just an unfortunate encounter. After that, I saw him often, lingering around our street. I made it a point not to interact with him, but one day he approached me when I was walking to the corner shop. I didn't respond to his weird chatter, so he just said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll wait for you in front of your house. We can talk then." My stomach dropped. I hoped he was joking, but when I returned to my street, there he was, sitting on my doorstep with his flatmate, just waiting for me. I panicked and ducked behind the corner, calling the only guy flatmate I had to come and chase them off. But of course, he wasn't home, and neither was anyone else. So I waited around the corner, heart pounding, until they finally left an hour later. I sprinted back to the house and locked myself inside, terrified. From that point on, I avoided him at all costs, but things took a darker turn. One day, while I was smoking in the backyard, I noticed that the wooden door, which was always closed, had been forced open. The strings we had used to tie it shut were cut. I assumed one of my flatmates had just forgotten to secure it after taking out the trash. So I closed it again and tied it up with a new string, not thinking much of it. The neighbors continued to yell and scream in their house at all hours of the night. It became so routine that my flatmates and I learned to sleep through it. But then, one night, my boyfriend was staying over. He's a deep sleeper, usually oblivious to noise, but he woke up suddenly, shaking me awake in the middle of the night. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I hadn't heard anything, but we stayed still, listening in the darkness. That's when we heard it. A loud bang, then whispering. My heart raced as the wooden door to the backyard slammed open. Footsteps crunched the gravel outside my window, which was partially open because of how warm my room got. We froze, barely breathing, as we heard the door handle rattle softly. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. The curtains were closed, but we could hear them muttering in a language we didn't understand. Then we heard them pushing at the window, trying to open it wider. That was when my boyfriend and I sprang into action. We grabbed our phones, threw on some clothes, and bolted out of the room. We didn't stop until we were outside the house, frantically calling our flatmates and telling them to lock themselves in their rooms. The police arrived in minutes, thank God, because their headquarters were only a few streets away. After that, everything is a blur. I remember being in shock, trembling as the police searched the property. They caught one of the guys hiding in the backyard. The other managed to flee, but was later found a few streets away, smoking weed. When the police searched their house, they found meth, heroin, and, horrifyingly, a massive kitchen knife. I still don't know why they targeted us. I had never spoken to them, never done anything to provoke them. The thought of what they might have intended that night, with that knife in hand, haunts me. One of the guys ended up getting 2 years in prison for carrying a weapon with the intent to harm, but we never heard anything else from the police. I moved back home a few months later, unable to shake the fear and anxiety that consumed me. To this day, I wake at the slightest noise, gripped by a terror that feels fresh and raw. It's been 2 years, and I still can't stop asking myself, what if? What if my boyfriend hadn't woken up? What would have happened if we hadn't escaped in time? It's a small comfort that I'm still with my boyfriend. We talk about that night sometimes, and it helps, but the shadows of what could have happened loom large. I don't think they'll ever fully go away. My creepy neighbor is obsessed with my daughter. My husband, daughter, and I moved into our new house about a month ago, and right away, something about the neighbor next door set me on edge. He barely paid me any attention until he noticed my 25-year-old daughter, and that's when things started to get really disturbing. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. We were outside one day, working on a flower bed that faces his house, when he wandered over to chat. He'd done this once before, so I thought nothing of it. But as he approached and caught sight of my daughter, his demeanor changed completely. His eyes went wide, His movements became jittery, and he kept glancing at her throughout the conversation, barely managing to look away. I only realized how bizarre it was when I caught him staring at her. The longer it went on, the more uncomfortable I felt. My daughter noticed too. To defuse the situation, I told her to head inside, saying she'd helped enough for the day. That encounter was just the beginning. After that, whenever she went out to check the mail or take out the trash, he'd suddenly appear, lingering outside, trying to talk to her or just watching. She grew more and more unsettled and eventually stopped using the front door altogether. Instead, she started slipping out the back to help me in the garden or to fetch things from the shed. But somehow, he figured out her new routine. It didn't take long before we'd catch him standing behind his fence, just staring silently at our backyard, eyes fixed in her direction. He's been watching the house, waiting for her to step outside, keeping track of her every move. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just a nosy neighbor. He was obsessed. Now, my daughter refuses to leave the house unless she's with friends or heading straight to work. She's not comfortable even being in the yard anymore, and I can't blame her. The situation only worsened when he started knocking on our door every other day, insisting on chatting with me. He never fails to end the conversation by asking personal questions about her, questions that make my skin crawl. It's obvious that his interest in her is far from innocent. It's gotten to the point where we just don't answer the door when he comes around. My husband is usually at work, leaving me alone to deal with the unsettling knocks and his persistent questions. It's creepy, invasive, and downright nerve-wracking. The worst part is, I don't feel like I can call the police. He hasn't technically done anything illegal. He's just being weird. But this behavior, the constant watching, the fixation, it feels like the calm before a storm, and I'm terrified of what might come next. So, I'm stuck here, jumping at every knock on the door, wondering what I should do. How do you protect your family from someone who hasn't broken any laws, but is slowly crossing every unspoken line? If anyone has advice, I'm all ears, because I don't know how much longer we can put up with this. I had a very creepy neighbor once. I was so unnerved by him that I ended up breaking my lease just to get away. There was something off about him, an uncanny wrongness I couldn't put my finger on. It was mostly his eyes. While his pupils were technically round, they looked strained, as though he was forcing them into a shape they weren't meant to hold. His eyes always seemed to be on the verge of something unnatural. The veins tinged with a bluish hue that didn't quite match the faint odor of marijuana that constantly wafted from his apartment. But the smell? That smell never felt right. I had a gut feeling that the heavy scent of weed was just a mask for something much more sinister. His voice was strange too. We rarely spoke, but when we did, his words had an eerie echo to them, almost like multiple people speaking at once. I remember once catching him in the hallway, chatting with another man who looked eerily similar to him, and I swear, his mouth didn't even move. People were always coming and going from his place, though I could never shake the feeling that more people went in than came out. I tried to be the live and let live type, ignoring the oddities, but sometimes I wish I hadn't. The worst of it came late one night. It was around midnight, and I had to get up early for work the next day. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural chanting drifting through the walls. I'd always suspected he was into some weird occult stuff, but this was different. This wasn't some casual interest in the mystical. It was unsettling. Bone deep. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront him and tell him to keep it down. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a strange, shimmering glow seeping out from under his door. My heart pounded as I approached. It's just the TV, I told myself. Maybe some LED lights. But then the smell hit me. A chemical stench mixed with the foulness of rotting fish. It burned my sinuses, and I began to choke, my eyes watering. I raised my hand to knock, but suddenly it felt impossibly heavy. My entire body seemed to sag, as if some unseen force was pressing down on me. Then, the walls started to breathe. They rippled and twisted, like living flesh. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. I collapsed to the floor, the chanting growing louder and more distorted. It wasn't in any language I recognized, and it had a quality no human voice should possess. The space around me melted into darkness, and a terrible drumming sound began, punctuated by the eerie wail of some otherworldly instrument. I shrieked as I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice, crystallizing in a way that made my entire body throb with pain. Have you ever felt so shocked that you couldn't move? That's what it was like. My muscles contorted against my will, jerking me into a grotesque dance. I wanted to scream, to claw my way out of that inky blackness, but I was trapped, forced to dance in torment to that hideous, unholy music. Time lost all meaning. Seconds, minutes, hours. It was all a blur of agony and madness. The drumming grew louder, the piping more discordant, until I thought my body would tear itself apart from the sound. And then I felt it, a presence looming above me. It was something ancient and incomprehensible, a thing beyond human understanding. A mix of fear and a strange, twisted nostalgia filled me. I didn't want to look up to see whatever horror was casting its gaze on me, but I had no choice. My head began to turn, inch by inch, toward the sky. Mercifully, that's where my memory ends. I blacked out before I could see whatever awaited me in that darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on my kitchen floor, staring at the clock. It read 12:01 a.m., barely a minute after I had left to confront my neighbor. The chanting was gone, the light and smell under his door vanished. I got up, legs trembling, and peeked out into the hallway. The corridor was quiet, empty. His door was closed, as if nothing had happened. The next day, I called my boss and quit my job. By the end of the week, I had moved back home, abandoning my lease. I wish I could forget that experience, but I can't. Every now and then, when the house is too quiet, I hear that rhythm, the drums, the piping, and my stomach clenches with fear. Worse still, I've started sleepwalking. I set up a camera once to see what I was doing during the night, and when I watched the footage, I saw myself twisting and contorting in that hellish dance. I deleted the video immediately, vowing never to record myself again. The most unsettling part? My new boss has that same uncanny look in his eyes, the same strained pupils that send a shiver down my spine. And I can't help but wonder if I've really escaped, or if I've just stepped into another circle of the nightmare. The Rabbit and the Neighbor. When I was 7, we had a new neighbor move in next door. At first, he seemed like a quiet, normal guy, but one afternoon, he came pounding on our front door. His fist thudded against the wood so hard, I thought he might break through. My dad opened it, only to be met with a barrage of screams and threats. "Shut that animal up, or I'll kill it. Do you hear me? I'll kill it," he yelled, his eyes wide and wild with fury. We stood there frozen, confused. We didn't have a dog, no birds or chickens either, just a small rabbit, nestled in its hutch in our backyard. A rabbit. That's what drove him into such a rage. We never knew why it bothered him so much, but the memory of his twisted face and the way he stormed off still haunts me. To this day, I can't hear a rabbit thump without feeling a chill creep up my spine. The ice cream shop. When my sister and I were 5 and 6, we lived in a tiny town of about 600 people. It was a close-knit community where kids often played outside, sometimes even without parents around. We had a neighbor, an older man, who would occasionally take us to the local ice cream shop. We never thought much of it. After all, who doesn't like ice cream? Our mom didn't know about these outings. They were our little secret, a fun treat from the kindly man next door. One day, however, everything changed. My mom hurriedly packed up our things, and within a few days, we moved without explanation. Years passed before we learned the truth. Our neighbor was a registered sex offender and pedophile. My mom found out and immediately took us away for our safety. To this day, I shudder to think of those trips to the ice cream shop. Thankfully, my sister and I were never harmed, but knowing how close we were to danger still sends a shiver down my spine.